And hello, everybody. And lovely to have the opportunity tonight to talk to you about trees. As Karen said, really, I am very much in gardens, and I have been all my life. I mean, I think I'm very fortunate in the fact that actually my job has also been my hobby. And I've been gardening really since I was a child. And, people say, what if they ask me what my achievements are, I always say that, what I consider one of my achievements was that I left the school rugby team to go and work in a florist when I was about 13. And because I've always actually loved plants and flowers and actually also very much working with people. And I did a degree in horticulture at Bath University. I worked in Europe for an export nursery producing trees and shrubs. I worked in a garden centre. I've worked in a parks department, in Birmingham Parks Department. And I worked for Hillier Nurseries, who some of you will have heard of, for 37 years, latterly as managing director. And I left Hillier really because I decided that I'd had enough of the commercial world and I wanted to get very much more back into gardens. And I'm very fortunate now that I do spend all of my time outside and I work with a great variety of gardens and landscape projects. And I come at it very much from the plant point of view, because I believe very strongly that plants and that landscape and gardens are about plants first and foremost. And I think that is, really in a way what you're trying to do is to actually bring that landscape to a very sort of tangible level. And interestingly, this weekend, actually, I was doing a radio program about somebody who I'd worked with for many years, actually, on Gardeners' Question Times. And he was Brian Kidd. He was head of Portsmouth Parks Department. And Portsmouth, of course, is very much it's a very urban area, and it's not a particularly wealthy area. And he worked with the parks for very many years and actually really changed the face of Portsmouth. And when, I think one of his great legacies was that when asked, he said that he wanted everybody to be able to see a tree from where they lived. That was his objective in the city, because he saw a tree as a field on a stick. And if they actually could see a tree, they actually had a connection with the surrounding landscape and countryside. And that is so true. Trees really are very much the aerials that connect us with the rest of the world outside. It's not about technology, it's not about all of the things that we think about, but it's realistically, what actually sort of connects the whole country together. So I could go on talking about the sort of theory of that for some time, but I'm going to go into the beauty and benefits of trees. And tonight is not really about a particularly structured lecture. I'm not going to give you lots and lots of information. It's very much really about images and things to think about as to actually what trees really bring to us. And I think that perhaps I hope puts what you're doing even more into context. And it's interesting that our landscape, whatever the season, really, when you get into the rural landscape, I think we sometimes forget how much trees are part of that. I mean, how much they dominate. They are the biggest, really the biggest living things on the planet. They're a very dominant feature, and they're so important because, of course, without them, then our atmosphere suffers and actually doesn't particularly exist. They're an environment, they're a habitat, And from our point of view, they also do have enormous aesthetic importance, because they are very much what really molds the actual world that we live in. In gardens, you know, what I always say to people is that actually that, you know, a garden without trees is very much a two-dimensional landscape. You know, add trees and suddenly the thing changes into something which is totally three-dimensional. This is our garden. We're in down in Hampshire, just outside Romsey. And when we moved here, we've been here this year for 20 years. And when we moved here, there was really nothing here apart from grass. And at the background there, you can see our sort of the mature oak trees which surround our plot. Everything else here we've planted and added. And as we've sort of moved into the space and we've planted more trees, and you know, when I came here, I'd sort of thought, you know, the first year I planted about half a dozen trees, wondering if I'd overdone it. And now I think we're up to about 50 or 60. And still planting. And I think it's, you know, it is the trees really which totally dominate and actually bring the garden to life. And also actually they're the things we are so fortunate in the fact that we live in temperate regions. So we have the changing seasons, which we tend to take for granted. You know, in a tropical landscape, it's evergreen, much less changing, but we have this fantastic mark of the seasons and an ever-changing picture, and we'll see a bit more of that actually probably as we go along. Trees actually are also wonderful at creating that sort of wonderful naturalistic appeal, and you know, one of the magical things about them is actually how they change the light, how they sort of diffuse and how they move and how they bring the whole landscape completely to life. And, you know, the sort of combination of trees and meadow, naturalistic grass with wildflowers is one which features increasingly in landscape projects today, both in urban areas and in the countryside. And you know, in the clients that I deal with, I think this is often everybody's dream landscape. You know, you say, what would you like to see? And they'd love to see long grass with wildflowers and, you know, the light height that's provided by airy deciduous trees. Sadly, I think, you know, sometimes people are quite frightened by trees because of their scale and how big they're going to get. And there is often concern, which is unfortunately is sometimes underlined by insurance companies, telling people, you know, that, oh, for goodness sake, don't plant a tree close to your house because it could actually get into your drains, it could undermine and everything else. And I think that is something that really can be a challenge really to those of us that are trying to green the environment, to make sure that people understand that the sort of relationship between ourselves and buildings really is, and trees is just so very, very important. You've been planting as we've been talking about, and you know, planting projects actually come in all sorts of different scales. And of course, one of the biggest in recent years is the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, which I'm sure most of you will have visited. Hillier Nurseries actually supplied most of the actual trees for the park. And that was a phenomenal project. And I always think it's quite interesting when you look at something like this, because of course people look at structures, they talk about the infrastructure, they talk about stadiums, they talk about the accommodation and everything else. But of course, all of those materials are manufactured, and they all have a relatively short manufacturing time. Whereas when you're looking at mature trees like this, which were planted at that size on site, you know, that takes, Mahilio started to actually prepare the trees for this site probably 10 years beforehand. And those were already, in a lot of cases, 10 years, 20 years old. So there, and it's a very finite resource. I think we sometimes underestimate what a finite resource this is. It's something you can't just magic up and say, yes, I'm going to plant a park. You started actually really rightly with young plants which are going to grow, and you know, the care and nurture that you give those is going to be key to the success of that landscape in the longer term. You know, likewise, these trees actually in planting terms, they have to be planted at the right depth. They have to have the right securing system to actually keep them in position and keep them upright. And they have to have an enormous amount of water and care to actually make sure that they succeed in the long term, to actually preserve this for the future. I said, you know, that trees, we're very fortunate in the fact that we have the sort of changing season. And you know, and trees are, I think we notice trees in spring, because actually we have a lot of trees which actually flower, the new foliage, the sort of freshness of new leaves on bare branches. In summer, I always think, you know, trees are at their least noticeable for us in summer because they become part of everything else. You know, you've got green fields, you've got green grass in parks, and trees become almost sort of part of that sort of undulating greenness that we take for granted, but we also crave, because it's a very calming color. It makes you feel good. It is, you know, it's obviously enormously beneficial in health terms. The highlight of the year for me personally is always autumn, because I love autumn, because I love the colours. I sort of very much gravitate towards the sort of sunset colours of autumn and the sort of drama of foliage in the changing seasons. But trees, you know, as much as those autumn colours actually are a highlight at that time of the year, they really come into their own now. And, you know, driving back tonight, just as the sort of light was really starting to dip and you've got a sort of relatively clear sky, even if it's that sort of slaty grey, you know, the drama of silhouettes and shapes is really quite arresting and something that, you know, is to be treasured. And I think, you know, as your trees start to grow, then they start to become individuals. You know, I know you've planted, I think you planted hawthorn, you planted hazel, you planted mountain ash, you planted a variety of species. And at this stage, they probably all look quite similar because they're sticks. And next spring, they'll look slightly different because they'll have a few leaves on. But, you know, as they grow, they start to take on a totally different character. And that's really where they become individuals. What I think are the really great values in selecting trees for me, you know, when I'm selecting trees for gardens, I'm always looking for trees which have got more than one season of interest. I think plants need to work quite hard when you put them into a smaller space. So something like Prunus shurati, for example, which is one of the loveliest flowering cherries. It has a wonderfully horizontal habit. In spring, for about 2 weeks, it has this amazing display of double white blossoms hanging on the branches, that lovely fresh sort of spring fragrance. And then in autumn, it has sensational foliage colour. And it also has this very charming habit. Interestingly, actually, this tree, actually, a well-known gardener told me years and years ago that actually if you planted one of these each side of a path, they would grow together to form an arch. So when we actually planted the garden at Sandhill Farm originally, I planted two, one each side of a path, thinking I'm sure that'll never work, they'll never grow together. And sure enough, they have actually grown together and formed a really rather perfect, though rather low archway. And they're a tree that we enjoy at all times of the year. I think there is always an attraction to evergreen trees, and particularly as gardens get smaller and people have a greater desire for screening. And it's an interesting thing, you know, the effect really of foliage against buildings is what a difference that actually makes. And how it actually does more and more bring the sort of countryside into the landscape. Personally, I think evergreen trees can be really quite heavy, and they can be quite impersonal. In the right setting, they're dramatic. I'm never convinced completely that they do such a good screening job rather than actually attracting attention, because I think something like Magnolia grandiflora is a fabulous plant to set against a building, but where you actually want somebody to look at the building and look at the magnolia, not necessarily to actually screen it. Birches are probably the most popular group of trees. And one of the great attractions, of course, is the white bark. I show this one. This is the Himalayan birch. This is Betula utilis jackmontii. Utilis basically means useful, which refers to the fact that this has been used for timber, for fuel, for paper, great variety of purposes. And this, interestingly, is the most widely planted tree in gardens. And when you actually see the size of a mature birch like this, you realise that sometimes maybe it's actually not always the best choice. In landscape situation, birches are very widely used because they make instant impact. You know, a group of, this is our native Betula pendula. Betula pendula is a very familiar sight around where we live here, because we're on the edge of the New Forest. So there's areas of moorland which have copious quantities of Betula pendula, which is a tree I love because it has a lot, you know, left in the natural environment. It has an enormous amount of character. And there's no doubt about it, for quick landscape, this is very effective. However, one should consider that actually a birch is a short-lived tree. These have a lifespan in a situation like this of up to 30 years. Whereas actually the trees that we admire most probably in our landscape are those which actually have a lifespan of maybe 200 or 300 years. And when you see a mature oak, there's no doubt about it. I mean, its presence is undeniable. This is the native oak, Quercus robur, the English oak. A very beautiful and characterful silhouette, which drops its leaves really quite late. Habitat for probably something like 300 species of insects on a single tree. A variety of birds, small mammals will live in it. So in itself, it's an ecosystem. And, you know, we do have to consider, we have a responsibility really to be planting for future generations as well, and making sure that they can also enjoy trees like the oak, the beech, which again, long-lived hardwood tree, which lasts for many years. And, you know, beech, more of a feature probably on the sort of more alkaline soils, whereas oak, more of a feature on the ones which are sort of neutral to acidic. Big trees, which need space, but certainly ones where parkland, big open spaces in cities should be planting also young plants of hardwood, because otherwise, when we lose the legacy of the Edwardian era, we won't actually have these to actually enjoy. You know, in some instances, this is actually, I took this summer actually at Leonards Lee down in Sussex. And Leonards Lee is a big estate with a long history. The gardens originally planted by the Loader family, who are famous actually for rhododendrons. But what was quite pleasing to see here was that actually generations have considered replacement. So the tree in the foreground there is a mature Cedrus atlantica glauca, probably something like 200 plus years old. And then the one behind it is a younger specimen that one of the latter generations has planted with a view to it taking over when this magnificent old tree eventually declines in probably another 100, 150 years. On the same site, Pinus sylvestris. Now, Pinus sylvestris is our native Scots pine. There are relatively few natives. And, you know, some things which we consider as native really aren't. And when it comes to native evergreens, there's only two native conifers, evergreen conifers in the UK, and that is the Scots pine and the yew. There's very few broadleaves, holly and ivy, which are truly native. Pinus sylvestris is characterised by its slightly bluey needles. The one in the middle there is a middle-aged specimen, I would say. A Scots pine can live for up to 600 years, which is really quite remarkable. The ones alongside it are younger specimens, which again have been planted with a view to them taking over these stands of mature trees. Scots pine also has some rather splendid bark. It has this sort of lovely reddish bark with all these crevices in it. And again, this is a habitat in its own right, and will be a home to hosts of insects. Also a tree that's very much favoured by woodpeckers who make their homes in the sort of sockets left by decayed branches, which actually these shed actually as they mature. But certainly trees which live for a very long time and attain a very considerable height. Not such a height probably as this. This is the giant redwood. This is Sequoiadendron giganteum. Not a native tree, but one that you do see in the landscape. And, you know, once you sort of get your eye in, you'll see this in all sorts of locations. In London, you'll see them towering at Kew. You'll see them at Syon. You'll see them, I think there's one there at Chiswick House. And in a lot of the parks, attain a great height, a great girth, and actually also a great age, and of course an enormously important habitat in that soft fibrous bark for a wide variety of creatures. Trees do you actually, one of the ways that, trees sort of affect our landscape, and, I think it's something that even in a much smaller environment you notice, is actually how much they frame vistas and how much they do create vistas. I was responsible for the Hillier exhibit at the Chelsea Flower Show for many years. And, in that situation, I mean, it's a show garden situation, so it's quite different, but the principles are exactly the same, is that we use trees a lot, particularly in the foreground, to create perspective and actually change the landscape. And you'll find, as your young trees grow, the ones you've planted, as they grow, they will actually change the perspective completely. They create views, they create vistas, and they make the distance move further because you focus more on what's in the foreground. And that's a principle actually that you should always sort of consider if you're planting in your own garden, is the more height that you bring closer, the actual more the distance moves away. So in a small space, one of the worst things you can do is to pin everything around the edge. You should bring your height close to where you're looking from, and that way you will actually increase the size of the space. I said, when we moved to Sandhill Farm, there was really nothing, and we planted trees, and we planted a variety of shrubs and perennials, and we suddenly had space. We moved from a small cottage garden to 2.5 acres, and that really was the main reason. Personally, I wasn't particularly interested in the house. I was interested in the space and having the land and being able to indulge myself in all of the things that I'd always wanted to grow. But of course, actually, as trees mature, they change the growing environment. And that isn't a disadvantage. It's just something that you actually have to adapt to. And that's the same in any type of sort of amenity or landscape environment as well. You have to actually go with the conditions. I'm a great believer that you always plant what will grow. I personally never use irrigation systems. I don't really believe in them. I think you have to plant. Obviously, when you plant something new, you've got to water it. You've got to actually establish it. You've got to make sure it gets its roots down. But it has to be able to actually survive in the environment in which you planted it. And undoubtedly, you'll find that some of your plants will thrive and some will probably not survive. But that doesn't really matter, because it's the survivors and the ones that thrive are the ones that, are right for that environment. And, as the environment changes over the years, then so does the planting. So, beds that we had in full sun are now perhaps quite shaded. So you actually gradually change the underplanting. You don't actually struggle to still grow your roses and perennials and the sun lovers, which you had there in the first place. You adapt and you modify. Trends in trees, and it's quite interesting to sort of look at actually the way that trees have changed in the landscape. I think in some ways they're also changing back, but I'll come on to that in just a moment. A lecturer that I had at university, who some of you again may have come across, is a sort of wonderful chap called Peter Thoday. And Peter actually has done sort of various sort of quite high profile things, including he was actually he became the horticultural advisor on the Eden Project. And he was referred to hedges as vegetable masonry, which I always thought was quite interesting because it was a way of actually using plants to actually create a wall, to create a structure. And he always referred to trees as piloty structure, a sort of wonderful, sort of airy term. And the trend in recent years has been to change that and change trees in some cases to vegetable masonry, partly because it's control and also because it's suited a style of architecture. The good thing about it is it does bring in green into restricted spaces. They're relatively easy to maintain because basically you're trimming them on a regular basis. Even though that's a bit of a challenge at height, it does mean that you actually can control. They've been particularly important in developments like airports because they restrict the amount of birds which will inhabit them. But of course, in doing so, they are actually restricting their environmental impact. And it's interesting when you look at an example like this. This again is the Olympic Park. And, you know, where you see these sort of light, airy trees, you can see how much more they actually diffuse the buildings than the hard structure which echoes them. And for me, I think this type of planting has much more impact, and it's probably much more what we're all aiming at. I think it makes you feel better. I think it's much softer. And again, it actually has the movement that I think is needed. Commercial production in the field like these, I mean, this is Pyrus chanticleer. This is probably one of the most widely planted trees, which retains a relatively natural habit. Pyrus chanticleer is an ornamental variety of pear. Its advantage is the fact it has very good, healthy foliage. It comes into leaf early and it falls late. It has a really quite pleasant display of white blossom early in the spring and fabulous autumn colour. And it's only just losing its last leaves now. So it's been in leaf since March. So it's 9 months of foliage. Surprising actually how much that varies. And when you're selecting trees, I mean, that is really quite a big factor. But one of the big factors, of course, that we're all planting for really is the benefits to wildlife. So in terms of habitat for insects, in terms of food and habitats for wild birds. And so this is a variety of sorbus actually here, and I know you've planted mountain ash, I think, haven't you, in your mix, some sorbus in there? I think there may be. And of course, actually, a tree like this has enormous benefits because it has flowers in spring and it also has flowers, it has fruit in the autumn. Hawthorn, I know actually you've planted, and hawthorn's actually, it is an interesting one because if you were offering somebody a hawthorn for the garden, the one they'd probably gravitate towards is this. And this is Crataegus Paul Scarlet. And Paul Scarlet is beautiful in flower. You know, it flowers in May. It's got these wonderful double crimson flowers in clusters. A tree in bloom is a lovely sight, and it's undeniably popular. However, it doesn't have much in the way of autumn colour. It doesn't it isn't a rich source of nectar and pollen because the double flowers don't make that accessible. And also it doesn't produce any fruit. Whereas our native common hawthorn, Crataegus monogyna, has really nectar-rich and pollen-rich flowers in profusion in spring. It has good glossy green foliage through summer. It has good autumn colour, and of course the benefit of copious quantities of fruit, which are eventually taken by wild birds. So it's an all-round good wildlife plant. It's inexpensive to plant. It's long-lived. It has a very naturalistic habit. It is variable, obviously, because it's a species. So, you know, different plants have slightly different qualities. But it's a tough customer. It's drought tolerant. It's wind tolerant. It's salt tolerant. You know, if you walk on the coast, Crataegus is the one thing that you will see really on cliff tops as a survivor. And here, you know, this is in a landscape project. Here it is combined with prairie planting, grasses, prairie perennials, and the Crataegus actually providing the sort of naturalistic height and structure, which is so essential in this style of planting, where, you know, in late winter, everything will eventually be cut down and there'll be nothing there apart from the trees. Other trees, you know, I thought I'd talk a little bit about other types of trees and other reasons why you might plant them. In an ornamental sense, is, you know, you would also plant for foliage, and this is in our garden. This is actually taken a few years ago now, and that's it. One of the first trees we planted was this, which is Catalpa bignanoides aurea, which is the golden Indian bean tree. We planted this here really because we wanted something which gave really bright shade that we could grow underneath. And that is quite a consideration really, is actually how you can use the ground beneath, and also how you can use the tree as part of a planting scheme. I think often, you know, trees are sort of considered very much in isolation, whereas when you consider them in conjunction with other plants, they suddenly fit much more happily into the landscape. The reason we planted this quite close to the house, because this is really sort of, you know, the house is where we're looking from here, was the fact that actually it has a very open winter structure. So it's got a very open branch structure, so it doesn't impede the view down the garden during the winter months. And as I say, in summer, it gives you that lovely bright shade. One of the best known small trees, of course, for foliage is the Japanese maple. And Japanese maples have great beauty at all times of the year. Wonderful foliage in summer, beautiful in spring when they first come into leaf, fantastic autumn colour, and of course a very open structure. And I use Japanese maples a lot because I think they are really the epitome of what I believe is that no garden is too small to have the presence of a tree, or something which conveys the sort of maturity and again that three-dimensional aspect in a garden. And this is a tiny courtyard in Chelsea. And this garden has two areas. It's got this very small courtyard, which the downstairs rooms look out on, and also a roof garden above. Everything is in containers, but here we wanted to actually really give the impression of being out in a garden, and nothing does that more than the Japanese maples, and you can see in the corner there a multi-stemmed birch, which runs up way above the courtyard into the roof garden above. And it's great to see, you know, people in really confined spaces using that space really to create a green oasis. And what a transformation it made, you know, when we established this in the heart of the house. Trees for beautiful bark, Acer griseum, the paper bark maple. A tree which takes patience, and one really, again, long-lived, beautiful thing to actually plant for the longer term in a garden. The white bark birch that we saw earlier on. In a smaller garden, Jack Montii, Betula Jack Montii is feasible, particularly if you plant it as a multi-stem. And also if you do a certain amount of selective pruning when the tree is in leaf only, and take out some of the stems which are crossing over. And that's what we would call crown thinning. And also crown raising is removal of some of those lower branches. I refer to the fact that people are often frightened by the fact that trees get too big for a situation, but the height is not a problem. The space above a landscape is free to occupy, and if you create enough transparency in your tree canopy, then obviously you can still use all of the space underneath to grow. And certainly where trees are well managed, then actually they rob relatively little space on the ground beneath. That's Prunus cerula, Manchurian cherry, which has this wonderfully sort of burnished bark. And this isn't a private garden. Very good gardener, and actually one with an amazing eye, because I think you'll agree that that makes a very pleasing landscape. And the reason is because the qualities of the various plants have been used to enhance one another. The bronze carex beneath the prunus works brilliantly, and also those pick up on the brown winter foliage of the beech hedge, and the whole thing hangs together. And that's exactly what I was saying about, using the tree as part of the landscape. And what a contrast to these. Now, this is effective planting, which is a group of Prunus cerula, young Prunus cerula, planted really for the beauty of their stems. But what a difference that is in terms of actually how it feels with the rest of the landscape. You see, personally, I find this very stark, and I think, if that was carpeted with green beneath to actually make that a much greener space, I think it would be far more pleasing. And there are subjects that you can use, which again would work really nicely with those stems. And that's an uplifting sight, isn't it? And one which sort of cheers you, sort of in the cold of winter. And sometimes we forget, what an important effect trees have on what will grow beneath them. Why do the bluebells grow here? Well, the bluebells colonize this environment because they enjoy the shade of the sort of that light diffuse shadow of the beech trees. Why do they have bulbs? They have bulbs because they're there waiting beneath the ground. So when the conditions are warm enough, when there's a certain moisture in the ground, and before the canopy of the trees robs the actual light and the actual moisture from the ground, they're there and they're ready to bloom just at the moment as the trees are coming into leaf. And then you get that amazing effect. And of course, in any situation, flower bulbs clustered beneath trees is effective. That's Narcissus thalia planted under a white bark birch. Very simple planting, but very effective. Lots and lots of woodland plants are a delight really to actually involve in the landscape and grow with trees. And that's something, that as your landscape and planting develops, then it's something that you may want to introduce. Things like lamians, tiarella, telema, small-leafed ivies, some of the drought tolerant ferns and so on are things which actually can come in, and that sort of ecosystem can gradually evolve. And of course, we must remember, that trees are a support to other plants as well. This is a large-leafed ivy, Heterosulfur heart. Ivy is interesting because I think it's much reviled by lots of people because they always think it's actually strangling a tree. But actually, ivy grows naturally on sound trees. And its only threat to a tree is actually increasing the wind resistance of fragile specimens. So if it's a mature tree, which is sound, then it won't harm the tree. It's not a parasite. It's using it completely for support. But it's also an incredibly valuable habitat. Lots and lots of creatures use that ivy actually as a habitat. And also, ivy flowers are a marvelous source of nectar, and the fruits are also taken by wild birds. So it's a way actually with mature trees really of actually increasing the benefits. I thought I'd finish just with one or two pictures really of to make you feel good, I suppose, because that's actually at the end of the day is what I think that trees do. And I hope you feel the same, that actually, trees are something which you notice and that you enjoy and that we all appreciate. If you didn't, you wouldn't be here really listening to me rattling on about trees tonight. But, something like a flowering cherry like Prunus pandora, a magnificent sight, even in the smallest of spaces. My favourite, people often ask me, say, well, what is your favourite tree? And I think of all the trees, one that I plant time and time again, if I get the opportunity to have a free hand, which I do very regularly on what I plant in gardens, I choose Malus transitoria. And this is a variety of crab. It has a wonderfully sort of horizontal branched habit. It's broad and it's spreading. It sits beautifully in a landscape. And it has, in May, an absolute mass of these small, starry apple blossom flowers with the most incredible honey fragrance. And on a warm day in May, will be just absolutely buzzing with bees. Wherever you plant it, they just gravitate towards it. It has good autumn colour. It goes bright yellow in the autumn. It has a pretty cut leaf. And at the moment in the garden, it's there just with these tiny, tiny little yellow apples all over the branches, which will stay there until they're really ripe and then the birds take them. So it truly is a tree which is a delight through the seasons, and one that's understandably attractive. Likewise, another crab, Malus everest. The nearest thing where people want to grow, a lot of us actually sort of want to grow some produce in the garden. And, sometimes where people want an apple tree in a small garden, I would say, well, look, do you really want it for the fruit? And quite often they want it for the blossom and actually just to feel that there's something growing there, and also for the benefit, again, of wild birds and insects. And I will always point them in the direction of something like Malus everest, which is a fruiting crab. It has classic apple blossom flowers, and in autumn it has the most amazing fruits, which still hang on the branches now. And in gardens where Malus everest is planted, it's still got its fruit on at this stage in the season. gradually being taken by hungry birds as they go. So I think I've talked really for quite a long time, actually, and I hope I haven't kept you for too long tonight. But I suppose really what I would emphasize, I think more than anything, is, you know, with the trees that you've planted, this stage now is very key. You know, keep them free from weeds, from too much competition from the grass around, until they can actually stand for themselves. And that will take a couple of seasons. The past 2 summers have been very challenging. So you will need to water, and you'll need to keep an eye on them. But gradually, you know, as they get their roots down and they get established and they start to get away, they will become more self-sufficient. And then you will actually have to look at them, and you may have to make decisions of some that you will remove to give others the opportunity to grow and thrive for the future. But at the end of the day, if you do that and you take care of them, then it will give you a wonderful landscape, which will be a great pleasure for people moving forward. And, you know, the benefit of the natural world to anybody that's confined in any way is so important. And I think, you know, this summer really has been quite an illustration to actually the importance of gardens, parks, open spaces, when people haven't been able to get out quite as much and do what they want. And, you know, those of us that actually have gardens, and we have access to gardens easily all the time, I think have been so fortunate. And I think people who have had a park on their doorstep where they have been able to get out and exercise and enjoy, that has really been quite a lifeline through this whole period. And let's hope, you know, that we all have better things to look forward to, and that everybody has access to those at some point in the future. Thanks very much for listening. I do have a website, so do have a look at that, andymcindoe.com. I have done quite a few books, and actually those are available on there. But more than anything else, I wish you all actually happy gardening, and also, I suppose at this stage, happy Christmas.